hear about the British Empire in history, we usually picture huge armies in red uniforms and the Kohinoor diamond. But if you looked at Britain in the 15th and 16th centuries, no one would have given it a second thought. Back then, England was just a small, poor island, kind of a backwater in Europe, broken up and forgotten. It didn't have gold like Spain or a big army like France. But buried in that land was a hunger and drive that eventually took control of 24% of the world. That was Britain. To understand the story, we need to go back a bit. Centuries ago, the Roman Empire ruled over Britain. When the Romans left, the island became an open field for invaders. Vikings, Angles, Saxons, Normans, whoever came, they all trampled over this island. These repeated attacks gave the English a fortress-like mindset. They realized that if they didn't secure their sea borders, they'd always be slaves. At that time, the real power in Europe was Spain. Spain had discovered America and was bringing back loads of gold from there. The King and Queen of England just looked out the window and sighed. Real change came during the reign of King Henry Music. Henry broke ties with the Catholic Church and created his own Church of England. It wasn't just about religion, it was the first big declaration of independence. Breaking away from the church meant England would no longer be controlled by Rome or Spain. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, there was nothing on the table. Spain considered her an illegitimate queen and wanted to remove her from power. Elizabeth had only two options, either kneel before Spain or carve your own fate by cutting through the ocean's chest. Elizabeth's most trusted advisor, John Dee, was the first person to use the term British Empire. He explained to the Queen that England's future wasn't tied to the sea but to the ocean. The English realized they didn't have massive galleons like Spain, so they started building smaller ships with more cannons. They turned the ocean into their wooden walls. Elizabeth invested heavily and created the world's most advanced. The Navy was established. Spain had gold mines, but Britain had merchants, the joint stock companies. Britain came up with a new idea. They created companies where rich people invested money to explore new trade routes. The Global Ambition, the Muscovy Company traded with Russia, the Levant Company with the Ottoman Empire, and later the East India Company. All of this was driven by a hunger born out of England's poverty. They wanted spices, they wanted silk. And most of all, they wanted power before conquering the world. England took control of its colony, Ireland. In the 1650s, under the plantation policy, the English took land from the Irish and started settling British people there. This brutal system, the way they governed and the tactics they learned in Ireland, were later used in India, America, and Africa. Ireland was basically the testing ground where British imperialism was born. This is the biggest highlight of this chapter. To crush England, King Philip II of Spain sent a massive fleet of 130 ships. This was called the Spanish Armada. England's small boats faced the world's biggest fleet. But the British Navy's speed and strength, like a fierce storm, completely smashed the Spanish fleet. This victory made the English believe that God was on their side and that they could become the undisputed rulers of the seas. Elizabeth, in her famous speech, said, "My body may be that of a weak woman, but I have the heart of a king, and that king is England's." After conquering the sea, it was time to establish a foothold on land. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh. They tried to set up the first colony, but that colony disappeared. Even today, no one knows what happened to the people there. Britain realized that building an empire wasn't child's play. It took not just courage but also money, supply chains, and discipline. As soon as the 16th century ended, Elizabeth signed a charter that changed the map of the world. On December 31, 1600, the East India Company was given a monopoly to trade with the East. From then on, England was no longer just an island. Its traders were now on the world map. They were looking for places. Most history books say the British Empire started with trade. That's a white lie. The truth is, the first brick of the British Empire music was laid with piracy. At the end of the 16th century, England didn't have enough money to build an empire. Their only option was to steal from others, and their biggest target was the superpower of the time, Spain. Queen Elizabeth I officially hired some of the most feared pirates of the sea. They were. The world called them pirates, but England called them the Sea Dogs. Queen Elizabeth had given these raiders a special paper called a letter of marque. It basically meant they had the Queen's permission to loot any Spanish ship they came across. They could sink them and cause mayhem. In return, a big chunk of the loot went straight to England's royal treasury. It was the world's first crowdfunded crime. Rich London merchants invested money into these pirates' ships, and when the raiders came back with gold, everyone got their share. He got a share. With that blood-stained money, England built its first big navy. The Spanish called him El Drake, the Dragon. Back then, there was a huge bounty on his head. Francis Drake wasn't a nice guy. He was a clever, ruthless pirate who really gave Spain a hard time. Drake hid out in the jungles of Panama and ambushed a Spanish convoy carrying silver loaded on mules. There was so much silver that the ships couldn't even carry it all. In 1577, he set off on a ship called the Golden Hind. He circled the whole world. They set fire to Spanish settlements along the way and stole so much gold that when he returned, the Queen's share alone was more than England's entire government budget for that year. The Sea Dogs didn't just steal gold, they also dealt in humans. Sir John Hawkins was the first Englishman to kidnap people from Africa and sell them as slaves in America. This is the dark chapter of the British Empire that's often hidden. Hawkins' family crest even had a picture of a chained slave, Britain's wealth. It all started with the trade of human flesh called human cargo. Life on those ships was nothing short of hell. The food on board was rotten biscuits and rats. Half the soldiers died from scurvy. To keep discipline, they'd lash people until their skin tore off. But only one thing kept these men together: the loot. A successful raid could turn a lowly sailor into the richest man in London overnight. Britain knew they couldn't win a direct war against Spain, so they adopted guerrilla warfare. Spain. Key was the gold coming from America. The Sea Dogs cut off that supply line. Spain's gold started filling up England's treasury. These robberies economically weakened Spain and gave Britain the resources it needed to fund huge enterprises like the East India Company in the future. When Francis Drake returned from his world tour, the King of Spain demanded he be hanged like a pirate. But what did Elizabeth do? She boarded Drake's ship, knighted him, and made him Sir Francis Drake, Britain. They sent a clear message to the whole world: whoever robs for us is our hero. This mindset gave birth to Britain's belief that profit is more important than morality or ethics. By the end of the 16th century, the Sea Dogs had done their job. They shattered the myth of Spain's unbeatable navy, mapped out the sea routes, and gave England so much money that it could now go out and enslave the world under the guise of trade. But raiding the seas was one thing, taking over foreign land and settling colonies was something else. America. The disappearance of that colony had terrified the English. Now they needed a place to settle down, even if it meant shedding the blood of their own people. By the early 17th century, Britain realized that looting the seas wasn't enough. They wanted land. But America wasn't a paradise for the English, it was more like a graveyard. This chapter tells two stories that are some of the worst nightmares in British history. In 1587, under John White's leadership, 115 Englishmen landed on Roanoke Island, North Carolina. A year later, when John White came back, there wasn't a single person left there. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just one word carved into a tree: Croatoan. Did the natives kill them, or did they go mad from hunger and get lost somewhere in the forest? Even after 400 years, the mystery of the lost colony hasn't been solved. But it scared the English settlers who came after. In 1607, 3 ships landed on the coast of Virginia. They picked a spot and named it Jamestown, but that decision turned out to be their biggest mistake. The place was a swamp, the area. The water wasn't safe to drink. Mosquitoes were spreading malaria, and the nearby tribal group, the Powhatans, considered them enemies. The first people to arrive in Jamestown were rich gentlemen. They thought they'd strike gold there. They didn't know how to farm and didn't want to get their hands dirty. As a result, within a few months, the food ran out and death started to take over. This was the worst year in the history of the British Empire. It was winter. The natives had the Jamestown colony surrounded so no one could get in or out. Inside, there were 500 people, and there wasn't a single grain left to eat. First, they ate their horses, then the dogs, then the cats, and then the rats. When everything was gone, they started boiling the leather from their shoes to eat. Hunger wiped away all their morals. Graves began to be dug up. In a recent excavation, they found the skull of a 14-year-old girl from the Jain community who was reportedly cut up and eaten by her own people. One man even killed his pregnant wife, salted her flesh, and preserved it. By the time help arrived, only 60 out of 500 people were still alive. Disney turned this into a love story. It was done, but the reality was pretty bitter. Pocahontas wasn't a lover, she was a political pawn. The English had kidnapped her. They changed her name to Rebecca and took her to London to show investors that even wild people could be civilized. Pocahontas was married off to John Rolfe to keep a temporary peace between the natives and the English. Jamestown didn't find gold, but they got tobacco. John Rolfe brought tobacco seeds from the West Indies, and Virginia's soil took to it so well that the demand for it in England skyrocketed. Things got crazy. Tobacco made this dying colony rich overnight, but growing tobacco needed a lot of land and tons of workers. That's when they started snatching land from the indigenous people. The British realized grabbing land was more important than keeping the peace. The year 1619 in Jamestown's history laid the bitter foundation of today's modern America and the British Empire. It was the first time the House of Burgesses became the start of democracy. That same year, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown carrying 20 African slaves. This was officially the beginning of slavery in America. It was the beginning of slavery. On one hand, people were talking about freedom, but on the other, the business of chains had started. The tribal people realized the British were swallowing their land. On March 22, 10,622, the Powhatan tribe launched a united attack and wiped out a third of Jamestown's population. After that, the British adopted a total war policy. They burned the tribe's fields, destroyed their villages, and drove them away. Jamestown had now become a successful colony, but it came at the cost of thousands of lives, cannibalism, and slavery. Britain had figured out that to rule foreign lands you had to bury your compassion, but America was just the beginning. On the other side of the world, another continent was waiting for Britain. There were no swamps there, no hunger. What existed was endless wealth, spices, and a company that was about to become the richest organization in the world. In history, there's hardly been a private company that changed the world map. Just imagine a company today like Apple or Google, building its own army, attacking countries, and taxing millions of people. Start collecting payments. The East India Company was just like that, but it all began in a small room down a narrow alley in London. By the late 16th century, spices in Europe were worth as much as gold. There was huge demand for black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves to preserve meat and add flavor, but the Portuguese and Dutch had a monopoly on this trade. In 1599, Dutch traders overnight raised the price of black pepper by 5 shillings per pound. For London merchants, it was a real insult. On September 24, 1599, at London's Founders Hall 80, a secret meeting of merchants was held. They decided they wouldn't rely on others anymore. They would go directly to the East Indies and Asia themselves. These merchants presented a proposal to Queen Elizabeth I. They knew that the sea voyage was expensive and dangerous, so they needed a monopoly. Elizabeth signed a royal charter. It gave the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies exclusive rights to trade with the East for the next 15 years. This was one of the world's first joint stock companies. The idea was that everyone would share both the losses and the profits. This gave the company financial power that not even a single king had. Initially, the company's target was India, but the Spice Islands in Indonesia. But there they ran into a fierce enemy, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The Dutch brutally wiped out British traders in Indonesia. The British realized they couldn't win against the Dutch at sea. Defeated, they changed their strategy. They thought if not spices, then India's textiles and indigo dye could bring good profits. This was the turning point that India's fate changed. In 1606, a ship named Hector reached the coast of Surat. The captain was William Hawkins. He had a letter from King James. Hawkins was clever when it came to Emperor Jahangir. He knew Turkish. When he arrived at Jahangir's court, he impressed the emperor by speaking in Persian and Turkish. Jahangir gave him the title of English Khan and included him in his drinking parties. The Portuguese were already settled in the Mughal court. They warned Jahangir that the English were thieves, which angered him and forced Hawkins to leave without any trading permission. In 1615, King James sent Sir Thomas Roe as an official ambassador. Roe was a seasoned politician. He knew that to impress Jahangir he had to come off not as a trader but as a representative of a great power. He spent 3 years ingratiating himself at the Mughal court. He gifted Jahangir European paintings, watches, and wine. Finally, in 1618, Jahangir issued a royal decree allowing the English to set up a factory warehouse in Surat. Roe wrote in his diary, "Don't trade through war but sneak in through peace." For them, a factory didn't mean a manufacturing unit but just a secure warehouse. But soon, walls and cannons started going up around these warehouses. They picked strategic spots: Surat in the west, Madras with Fort St. George in the south, and Kolkata with Fort William in the east. The company realized they needed hired soldiers for protection. That's where their private army was born, an army that would later challenge even the massive Mughal forces. In 1661, an event happened that gave the company an impregnable fort on India's west coast. King Charles II of England married Catherine, the Princess of Portugal. The Portuguese gave the island of Mumbai as dowry. For Charles, it was just a worthless, remote island, so he leased it to the company for just £10 a year. The company turned Mumbai into a deep-water port from where they could control the entire Arabian Sea. As long as Aurangzeb was alive, the company didn't dare to get bold. Once in 1686 they tried to pick a fight, but Aurangzeb kicked their butt so bad that the English they had to kneel down and ask for forgiveness. The British learned a lesson from their defeat. Don't fight the Mughals head-on just yet. Wait for them to weaken and meanwhile, keep expanding your army under the pretext of trade. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal Empire started crumbling like a house of cards. Nader Shah's invasion broke Delhi's backbone. This was the golden opportunity the company had been waiting for 100 years. The company treated the ailing Mughal Emperor Farrukhsiyar, and in return the emperor issued a decree that became a document marking India's downfall. Now the company could operate in Bengal without paying any taxes. They could do business. The company got the right to mint its own coins. A private company was now controlling a country's currency. The East India Company was no longer just a group of traders. It had become a state within a state. They had money, they had technology, and now they had a dying empire that they were slowly going to swallow up. But they weren't alone in India. The French were standing right there in the same line. In the 17th and 18th centuries, tea wasn't just something you drank, it was a big deal back then. It was all about oil. In Europe, people were getting crazy for tea, coffee, and chocolate, and all those needed sugar. Islands in the Caribbean like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua turned into gold mines for Britain. But behind the shine of these sugar islands was something else: forced control, unimaginable wealth, and a wave of death like never seen before. When the English arrived in Barbados in 1627, they first tried growing tobacco, but that didn't work out. Then they learned the sugarcane farming techniques from Brazil. As soon as they started growing sugarcane, the land prices in Barbados shot through the roof. Back in the 1660s, when this island had just a few thousand people, sugar turned it into the richest and most densely populated place in the world. A handful of planters and landlords got so wealthy they started controlling British politics. They were called the Sugar Kings. Sugar gave Britain's economy a boost that no other trade could match. Cities like London, Liverpool, and Bristol were built on sugar money. Taxes on sugar funded the British Navy so well that it became the strongest in the world. They became the world's biggest naval power. Sugar changed the diet of common British workers. With a cheap source of calories, workers were able to work longer hours in factories. In other words, the wheels of the British Industrial Revolution were turning because of Caribbean sugar. At first, poor white convicts and laborers from Britain were brought in to work on the plantations. These were called indentured servants. But they couldn't handle the scorching heat and diseases like yellow fever in the Caribbean. The planters realized they needed workers who could withstand this kind of climate. Those who could never be freed, they set their eyes on Africa. This is where the legal system of racism called the Barbados Slave Code was created. It declared humans as property. The British Empire made a law that a black person could never be equal to a white person. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell's army took Jamaica from Spain. This was Britain's biggest strategic win. Jamaica was much bigger than Barbados. Sugarcane farming was run like a factory here. Work went on day and night, cutting the cane and then processing it in mills. Stepping in felt like inviting death. One small slip and your hand would get caught in the machine. In Jamaica, slaves' lives were so cheap that planters figured it was cheaper to work them to death instead of feeding and caring for them than just buying new slaves. On average, a slave only lived around 7 to 10 years after arriving. It wasn't that the slaves had accepted their fate. Those who escaped into the dense forests and mountains of Jamaica set up their own settlements, called the Maroons. These Maroons fought against the British Army for decades. They even fought guerrilla wars. They proved that British guns couldn't completely crush the spirit of freedom. This was the biggest rebellion in Caribbean history. Thousands of slaves took up arms against the planters. Britain had to throw all its might to suppress it, and the cruelty they showed would have shamed even the devil. The Chinese created the world's largest trade network, the Triangle. From Europe to Africa, they sent alcohol, weapons, and clothes. From Africa to the Caribbean, the Middle Passage. And in exchange for these weapons, they traded humans. People were bought and packed into ships like animals. From the Caribbean to Europe, sugar, rum, and molasses, born from the blood and sweat of slaves, were sent back to London. Britain made a profit at every turn in this cycle. The sugar islands made Britain rich, but they hollowed out its soul. The churches and schools in London were built with money stained by the blood flowing in Jamaica's fields. Most owners didn't even live on the islands. They sat in their fancy London homes, only focused on profits. To them, people were just numbers. West Indies. There was a powerful group in the British Parliament called the Interest that crushed every voice against slavery. By the end of the 18th century, the soil was losing its fertility, and competition from French islands like Saint-Domingue shook Britain's monopoly on sugar. But by then, these islands had already given Britain the capital it needed to establish its full control over India. The story of the Sugar Islands isn't just about trade. It's about a system that made profit its god. And the darkest part of this system is yet to come. That journey no one wants to remember, where the ocean waves still echo with the screams of millions of enslaved people. History books usually talk about wars and treaties, but the grand British Empire buildings we see today are built on the blood and cries of 11.2 million Africans. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Britain turned this human trade into an industry. They treated Africa like a factory, where humans were the raw material. In 1660, the English royal family king Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York, founded the Royal African Company. This company had the royal monopoly on the slave trade from Africa. Did you know that slaves were branded with hot irons bearing the Duke of York's mark? It was proof that the person was now the property of a king. Between 10,672 and 10,731 Africans were chained and shipped across the sea by this company alone. That journey went from the African coast to the islands of America. It was a nightmare that lasted 6 to 10 weeks. A place where humanity died a little more every day. Ship captains loaded slaves in two ways. In tight packing, people were crushed on top of each other like stuff in a closet. They had no room to move, shift, or even turn over. The slaves were kept below decks where there was no fresh air at all. The stench of waste, blood, and sweat was so bad that you could tell it was a slave ship just by the smell, even before getting close. On this journey, 1 out of every 5 slaves didn't survive. People who got sick because of diseases, hunger, or depression were thrown alive into the sea so that the illness wouldn't spread to others and the insurance money could be claimed. When the ship reached America or the Caribbean, preparations were made to sell the slaves. They were dressed up like animals. To hide their wounds, oil was rubbed on them so they appeared healthy. Their white hair was dyed black to make them look young. One method of auction was called scramble. Slaves were lined up in a pen and buyers were given a signal. The traders would rush in and slaves were liked and captured. Families were torn apart. Mothers were taken by one master, children by another. Big cities in Britain like Liverpool, Bristol, and London were built on this blood money. The world's oldest banks like Barclays and Lloyds of London got their start financing and ensuring the slave trade. The sugar, cotton, and tobacco produced by the blood and sweat of slaves supplied raw materials to Britain's factories. Adam Smith talked about this capitalism in The Wealth of Nations. He explained that the fuel for all this was those innocent slaves themselves. Don't think the Africans just gave up. There were hundreds of rebellions on the ships. Many slaves refused to eat, hopping to die. To stop this, the English made a tool called a speculum oris that forced open their mouths and shoved food in. Thousands of people jumped into the ocean even while chained. For them, death was better than slavery. There are many stories of slaves killing the ship's crew and taking over the vessel. Still, beating the British Navy was a tough challenge. To justify slavery, British intellectuals and the church spread a dangerous lie. They twisted a part of the Bible to claim that African people were born to serve others. They falsely said that Africans were less intelligent and savage, so they argued it was necessary to enslave them to civilize them. The racism and racial discrimination we see in the world today are legacies of the British Empire. By the late 18th century, voices against this trade began to rise in Britain. Olaudah Equiano, who was once a slave himself, shared his own story. They shook the British by writing about it. The truth was, after the Industrial Revolution, machines started becoming cheaper than slaves. In 1807, Britain banned the slave trade, and in 1833 slavery was declared illegal. When slavery ended, the British government gave nothing to the slaves. Instead, they paid billions of dollars in today's terms to the owners whose slaves had been taken away. British taxpayers were paying off this debt until 2015. Slavery hollowed out Africa from within. Africa lost its youngest. And they lost even their strongest people. The tribes started fighting among themselves because the British were giving them weapons in exchange for slaves. Even today, the roots of Africa's poverty and civil wars go back to this period. The wealth Britain made by selling people made it the most powerful country in the world. But their focus was no longer just on the Atlantic. Now their eyes were on the golden bird of the East, where the East India Company had already set foot. The Nawabs and kings of India had no idea yet that the company they'd given trading rights to would soon be taking over their palaces. Someone was about to turn it into ruins. By the mid-18th century, the sun was setting on the Mughal Empire. And India was divided into small pockets ruled by Nawabs and kings. Two European superpowers, Britain's East India Company and France's French East India Company, were engaged in a bloody battle to seize India's precious resources. This was the duel for India, where the swords belonged to India but the mines were European. The real battle for India didn't start in Bengal but in South Karnataka. The French governor Dupleix was a genius. He was the first to show the world how Indians' power can be grabbed by meddling in the king's internal fights. Dupleix trained Indian soldiers in the European way. The British noticed that Dupleix was turning the kings into puppets, so the British started playing the same game. Robert Clive, who had just joined the company as a clerk, showed his military skills during the siege of Arcot and stopped the French influence from growing. That was the Grand Master's first move. Back then, Bengal, which included today's West Bengal, Bangladesh, Bihar, and Orissa, was the richest province in the world. About 25% of textiles used to come just from Bengal. For the British, Bengal was a golden bird they wanted to keep caged at any cost. In 1756, a young and hot-headed Nawab named Suraj ud-Dawla took power. He didn't like the British playing dirty tricks. He noticed the British were fortifying without permission and cheating on taxes. Suraj attacked Kolkata and drove the British out. It said he locked 146 British soldiers in a tiny room and around 100 of them died suffocating. The British called this the Black. They used the name Whole of Kolkata for their propaganda to find an excuse to attack the Nawab. Robert Clive came to Bengal from Madras with his army. He knew Suraj had 500 troops while he had 3,000. Winning a battle on the field was impossible, so Clive decided to win the war without fighting directly. He struck a deal with Suraj's commander Mir Jafar. The deal was simple: don't support Suraj in the battle, and in return we'll make you the Nawab of Bengal. Jagat Seth, the biggest banker in Bengal, also sided with the Brits. Because Suraj had insulted him, India's freedom had already been sold for a few coins and the greed for power. On the banks of the Hooghly River in the fields of Plassey, the two armies faced each other, but this wasn't really a battle, it was just a show. Suddenly it started raining. The Nawab's gunpowder got soaked because he had no way to cover it. The British had already covered their gunpowder with tarpaulins. As soon as the attack began, more than half of the Nawab's army, led by Mir Jafar, just stood still quietly. Suraj realized he'd been betrayed. He left the battlefield. He ran away but was caught later and killed. In just 11 hours, India's fate was sealed. Clive wrote that he entered Murshidabad, India's richest city, and was stunned by the treasure he saw. He looted gold and jewels worth crores. Mir Jafar became the Nawab, but he had no real power. He was forced to meet every demand of the company. The company not only took away Mir Jafar's right to collect Bengal's Diwani tax but also snatched his zamindari and demanded crores in penalties. Mir Jafar started being called Colonel Clive's donkey when Jafar ran out of money to pay the British, they removed him and put his son-in-law Mir Qasim in charge instead. This was the company's new business model: keep the Nawab in power as long as he had money to give, and as soon as the treasury was empty, bring in a new Nawab. Mir Qasim tried to break free. He formed an alliance with the Nawab of Awadh and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. In 1764, at the Battle of Buxar, the combined Indian forces faced off against the East India Company's army. This time, the British won not just through deceit but also because of their military superiority, the Indian rulers. The huge army was defeated. This treaty changed the course of Indian history. The Mughal emperor gave the East India Company the right to collect taxes from Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Basically, a foreign trading company became authorized to collect taxes from the people of India. After getting the tax rights, the company's greed grew so much that they imposed exorbitant taxes on the farmers. The company only knew how to take money, not how to govern. In 1770, when there was a drought in Bengal, instead of reducing taxes, the company collected them even more strictly. About one-third of Bengal's population, nearly 10 million people, died of hunger. Thousands of villages. The land had become desolate. People were forced to eat grass and bones to survive. Meanwhile, back in London, shares of the East India Company were soaring. This was one of the British Empire's most heinous crimes. When Robert Clive returned to England, he was the richest man in the world. He faced corruption charges but was acquitted. However, in 1774 he took his own life. The empire he built by looting India had turned into a giant monster that couldn't be stopped. The battles of Plassey and Buxar had handed Britain the keys to India. They were no longer just traders, they were kingmakers, but India still had many lions left. In Mysore, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, and in the south the Maratha Empire were about to become the biggest obstacles in the British way. Meanwhile, in Europe, Britain won a war that made it the sole naval emperor of the entire world. By the mid-18th century, the world was divided into two parts. On one side was France, which had the most powerful army on European soil and a vast empire. On the other was Britain, whose only strength was its sea and the Royal Navy. The rivalry between the two shaped the whole world. It turned into a global war zone. The surprising thing is this global war didn't start in Europe but in the forests of Ohio, America. A young British colonel, who the world now knows as George Washington, attacked French soldiers. Both Britain and France wanted to claim land in America. This small clash sparked a fire that spread across 5 continents. Britain's luck changed when William Pitt the Elder came to power. Pitt was a visionary. He understood that Britain needed to outplay France in Europe. He could never lose in a ground battle. Pitt came up with a master plan. He gave a lot of money to his ally Russia in Europe to keep the French army tied up there. Meanwhile, Britain put all its strength into its navy. Pitt's motto was that they would win America and India through battles fought in Europe. He completely cut off France's supply lines via the sea. Like we saw, the Battle of Plassey was part of this bigger war. A decisive battle took place between the British and the French in South India. Sir Eyre Coote defeated the French general Lally. The British surrounded the French stronghold of Pondicherry and pretty much crushed it. After this defeat, France was out of the running in India for good. India was now going to become a British colony. In Canada, France had a huge empire called New France. General James Wolfe attacked the fortress at Quebec. It was nearly impossible because the fort sat atop a high hill, but the British soldiers quietly climbed the hill under the cover of night. In the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, France was defeated, and Canada was lost forever. Britain took control. This war decided that from now on, people in North America would speak English, not French. The year 1759 is called the Year of Miracles in British history. The British Navy sank the French fleet right off their own coast. France had planned to attack England, but Britain completely crushed that plan. From then on, not a single French ship could sail any ocean without Britain's permission. Britain was no longer just an island, it was the sole ruler of the seas. The war wasn't just about land. It was all about profit. Britain took over France's richest Caribbean islands like Guadeloupe and Martinique. They also captured Senegal on Africa's Gold Coast, which strengthened their hold on the slave trade. By the time the war ended in 1763, the world map had completely changed. France had lost almost its entire American empire, including Canada and the land east of the Mississippi. In India, they were reduced to just a few small towns. Britain had become the world's biggest power, holding large parts of America, India, the Caribbean, and Africa. They had won, but they were drowning in debt. The war had been so expensive that the British treasury was completely drained. To pay off this debt, Britain decided to slap heavy taxes on its American colonies. The American people, who had just been fighting alongside Britain against the French, now started hating their own mother country. The Seven-Year War had made Britain a global power, but that very victory bred the pride that would later set fire to its own house. The Americans who had helped Britain win were now dreaming of their own freedom. After winning the war, Britain was the undisputed ruler of the world, but that victory had drained the British treasury. The leaders in London thought, since this war was fought to protect the American colonies, the Americans should foot the bill for it. This mindset was the first major step leading to the fall of the British Empire. The British Parliament passed one law after another: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. Through these laws, taxes were imposed on almost everything in America, even newspapers. And the Americans weren't against paying taxes on legal documents either. What they opposed was having no representatives in the British Parliament in London. Their slogan was, "If we have no representation, then we won't pay any taxes." Revolutionaries like Samuel Adams formed secret groups and started resisting British officials. The tension was rising. To save the East India Company, Britain imposed a tax on tea. On the night of December 16, 1773, some American revolutionaries disguised as Mohawk natives at Boston Harbor. 3 British ships were boarded. They threw 342 chests of tea into the sea. It wasn't just about losing the tea, it was a huge slap in the face to British rule. Angry Britain closed the Boston Harbor and imposed martial law there. Any chance of peace was gone. On April 19, 1775, the British Army set out to destroy the revolutionaries' weapons stockpile. In the fields of Lexington, a shot was fired. Nobody knows who fired it. But it's called "The Shot Heard Round the World." American farmers and common folks who were ready in a minute, called Minutemen, fought against the world's most disciplined army using their old rifles. In 1776, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. George Washington was put in charge of the army. Washington wasn't a great military strategist, but he had an amazing never-give-up spirit. He declared that all men are created equal. Although slavery still existed back then, this slogan. The whole world was stirred up. At first, the British Army, the Redcoats, were winning. But in 1777, during the Battle of Saratoga, America forced an entire British army to surrender. Seeing this victory, France, which was looking for a chance to get back at Britain, jumped into the war alongside America. Now for Britain, this wasn't just a rebellion anymore. It had become a full-on world war. In October 1781, Lord Cornwallis, who later became the Governor-General of India, got trapped in Yorktown. On one side was the American army and on the other side, the French fleet had blocked the sea. Cornwallis surrendered. As the British army was giving up, their band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The whole world was turned on its head. Truly, a tiny farming nation had defeated the world's greatest empire. With the Treaty of Paris in 1783, America officially became independent. Britain lost its most precious colonies. America's defeat taught Britain that they could no longer forcibly rule over white colonies. It was after this loss that Britain shifted its entire focus to India. They turned their attention elsewhere. They thought that if the sun had set in the west, it should rise in the east. Thousands of people loyal to Britain left America and moved to Canada, which strengthened Canada's British identity. Neither side gained anything from this war of independence. The indigenous people had sided with Britain because Britain promised to protect their lands. But after America's victory, their lands were brutally taken away. Thousands of enslaved people fought for Britain because Britain had tempted them with the promise of freedom. But in the end, they were chained again into slavery. America leaving was a huge blow to the British Empire, but that wasn't the end. Britain learned from its mistakes. They decided to find a new continent to make up for the loss of America, a place where they could send their criminals and set up a new government. In 1770, Captain James Cook discovered the eastern coast of Australia. Although people had been living there for thousands of years, he named it New South Wales. In 1788, Britain established its first penal settlement. Started with a penal colony. It was the biggest social experiment in history, a society built on criminals. On May 13, 1787, 11 ships left Portsmouth carrying about 750 convicts, including men, women, and children. Most of these people weren't murderers. Some had stolen a handkerchief, some a piece of bread, and some had taken a sheep. Britain's laws, known as the Bloody Code, were so harsh that even small thefts were punishable by exile. The journey lasted 250 days, with people chained up in dark, cramped rooms below the decks. When they landed at Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788, they were barely holding on. This day is now called Australia Day. But for the indigenous people, it's Invasion Day, a day of attack. The British made up a legal excuse to take over Australia called Terra Nullius, which in Latin means nobody's land. About 750,000 Aboriginals lived there, with a culture that was 60,000 years old, but the British refused to even acknowledge them as humans. They claimed that because the indigenous people hadn't fenced off the land. The land is empty because it hasn't been cultivated or farmed, so King George claims it. In Australia, there were places designed to be inescapable. They called it a prison within a prison. Criminals who even committed crimes in Sydney were sent there. The punishment was so brutal that prisoners would kill each other just to get a death sentence and escape that hell. Flogging was common. One prisoner could get whipped anywhere from 100 to 500 lashes at once, ripping the flesh off their back down to the bone. As the British started spreading out from Sydney, they took over the indigenous people's water sources and hunting grounds. The indigenous people fought back with spears and stones against British guns, but the British tactics were brutal. They poisoned the indigenous people's water supplies and hunted them down like human prey. On the island of Tasmania, the British wiped out almost the entire indigenous population. It's considered one of the most successful genocides in history. What's shocking is that from this very place, a modern nation was born. Prisoners who behaved well were given tickets of leave. They could do their own farming and trade. Gradually, these ex-prisoners became wealthy landowners. They started trading wool, which made Australia economically valuable to Britain. Factories in Britain now got their raw materials from this penal colony. In 1851, gold was discovered in New South Wales and Victoria. This changed Australia's fate. Now people started coming to Australia in the millions, not out of compulsion but by choice. Britain. They stopped sending criminals. The last ship arrived in 1868. The workers in the gold mines raised their voices for their rights. The Eureka Rebellion laid the foundation for democracy in Australia. The darkest chapter of the British Empire was their attempt to whitewash the indigenous people. For decades, British officials forcibly took Aboriginal children from their parents and gave them to churches or white families to make them forget their language and culture. This wound is still fresh in Australia today. Australia wasn't just a prison for Britain anymore. It became a strategic base for their navy. The gold, wool, and wheat coming out of there started fueling the veins of the British Empire. The people of Australia, once criminals, had now turned into the Crown's most loyal soldiers. Britain, on one hand, had turned Australia into a prison, but on the other hand, it was witnessing a revolution at home that was about to change how the whole world produced things. The smoke-filled chimneys and iron machines gave Britain the power that would shape its future, even against giants like China and India. It was going to bring great empires to their knees. At the end of the 18th century, something happened in Britain that divided human history into two parts: before the Industrial Revolution and after it. It wasn't just about machines coming in, it was a complete reboot of human society. Britain had coal, it had money looted from its colonies, and it had a passion for science. It all started in the coal mines. To pump water out of the mines, James Watt modernized the steam engine so much that machines could now be run anywhere. Steam power. He didn't just run machines, he gave life to trains, locomotives, and ships. Journeys that used to take weeks now happened in hours. For the first time, people weren't at the mercy of the weather or the wind. Britain proved it could deliver its goods wherever and whenever it wanted. Northern Britain turned into a land of smoky chimneys. Manchester became the cotton city known as Cottonopolis. This is the harshest truth of this chapter. India's handwoven muslin was famous worldwide, but Britain flooded the market with cheap cloth made by its machines. They squeezed us dry and cut off the hands of Indian weavers, both symbolically and economically. India stopped being a cloth seller and became a slave producing cotton for British machines. British textiles flooded markets all over the world. With that money, Britain made its navy even more powerful. Behind the shine of the Industrial Revolution was a dark, hellish alley where innocent kids were treated like parts of machines. 4- or 5-year-old children were sent inside chimneys because they could fit into tight spaces. Many kids suffocated inside. Kids used to die from this. In factories, children worked 16-hour shifts. If they got sleepy, they'd get beaten or dunked in cold water. Working between machines, thousands of kids lost fingers and limbs, and when they became useless, they were just thrown out onto the streets. People left their villages and rushed to the cities because machines were taking over farming. Cities got so crowded that 10 to 15 people had to cram into tiny rooms. There was no clean water or sewage system. Because of the filth, diseases like cholera and typhoid turned into epidemics. Streets in London and Manchester started filling up with dead bodies. Britain was getting richer, but the everyday people were living miserable lives. Not everyone was happy with this revolution. Skilled workers felt that machines were stealing their jobs. In 1811, a group called the Luddites attacked factories and started smashing machines. The British government sent the army to crush the rebellion. Breaking machines became a capital offense punishable by death. The empire made it clear, machines are more valuable than humans. Britain ramped up its iron production so much that it now They started building ships and bridges. The world's first iron bridge was built in England and became a symbol of Britain's strength. Britain began laying railway networks all over the world, especially in India, so they could quickly exploit raw materials from remote areas and send their army wherever needed. The Industrial Revolution created a new class, the middle class. These were factory owners, bankers, and engineers. Power was no longer just with the landowning nawabs and lords, but with those who owned machines. For the first time, consumerism was born. People started buying not out of necessity, but for advertising and hobby purposes. In 1851, the Great Exhibition was held in London. Britain showcased its machines in the huge glass palace called the Crystal Palace. The whole world was amazed to see it. Britain was no longer just a country. It had become like a machine god. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain the power and speed to crush any empire. But in Europe, a man emerged who challenged Britain's mechanical pride, a warrior who made all of Europe follow his lead. He crushed them below and forced Britain to burn every last drop of its strength to stop him. At the start of the 19th century, Napoleon had conquered all of Europe. Austria, Russia, and Prussia had all knelt before him. Only one small island stood in his way, Britain. Napoleon hated Britain and mocked it as a nation of shopkeepers. But he had no idea how far these shopkeepers would go to protect their country. Napoleon knew he couldn't defeat Britain's navy, the Royal Navy, head-on. So he came up with a plan. So the continental system it was. He ordered all of Europe not to trade with Britain. His goal was to starve Britain into submission. But Britain had its empire. It didn't need Europe because it had markets in India, America, and the Caribbean. In fact, Europeans started craving British goods and rebellions against Napoleon began. Napoleon had assembled thousands of soldiers to attack England. He just needed control of the sea for a few hours, but standing in his way was Britain. The greatest naval hero, Admiral Horatio Nelson. On October 21, 1805, near Trafalgar off the coast of Spain, the two fleets clashed. Nelson broke the old war tactics and attacked right through the middle of the French and Spanish ships. Before the battle, Nelson sent a signal quoting John Donne. England expects that every man will do his duty. Britain didn't lose a single ship and completely destroyed Napoleon's fleet, but Nelson was shot during the fight. As he was dying, he asked, "Did we win?" The answer was yes, and Nelson took his last breath. This victory decided. It was decided that Britain would rule the seas for the next 100 years. Napoleon took over Portugal and Spain, where Britain sent its ground troops. This marked the rise of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. The Spanish people started guerrilla warfare against the French, and Wellington fueled this resistance. Later, Napoleon admitted that the Spanish ulcer slowly drained his strength. Wellington proved that British soldiers could beat the French on land too. When Napoleon attacked Russia, his 100,000 soldiers died from cold and hunger. When he returned, he was already weak. He was defeated and imprisoned on the island of Elba. But the story didn't end there. Napoleon escaped from there and became the Emperor of France again. This is known as the 100 Days. On June 18, 1815, the biggest battle in history took place on the plains of Waterloo in Belgium. On one side was Napoleon, and on the other were Wellington's British army and his allies. From morning till evening, a brutal battle raged. Wellington's army was in a defensive position on high ground. Napoleon sent his fiercest imperial guards. Sent them in, but the British guns tore them apart. As evening fell, the Prussian army also arrived to help Wellington. Napoleon's army scattered. Napoleon was defeated and sent far away to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died. After Napoleon's defeat, Britain became the world's only superpower. Britain took control of strategic places like Cape Town in South Africa, Mauritius, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Malta. Now Britain held the keys to every major sea route in the world. Britain. Europe adopted a policy of keeping peace, so it could loot the whole world without any interruptions and expand its trade. Napoleon's wars gave Britain an opportunity it might never have gotten otherwise, because the rest of Europe, France, Spain, Holland, were wrecked by the wars. Britain started gradually taking over the territories those countries had controlled, adding them to its empire. From South America to the islands in the east, British pounds and British cannons ruled. Napoleon died, but the ideas of nationalism, patriotism, and democracy that he spread lived on. The British monarchy got scared. Britain became even more hardcore. It started crushing rebellions in its empire with even greater force. The Pax Britannica, the British peace era, began after 1815, but this peace was only for Europe. For the rest of the world, it was a brutal time of slavery, exploitation, and expansion. A woman was about to take the throne whose name would become synonymous with this empire. The period between 1815 and 1914 is called the British Century. During this time, Britain was the world's only global superpower. It had the largest. They had the navy, the biggest trade network, and the most land. Britain was basically the boss of the world, and their slogan was Civis Britannica Sum, meaning if you messed with any British citizen anywhere in the world, it was like firing British cannons at them. In 1837, at just 18 years old, Victoria took the throne. Her 63-year reign was a symbol of Britain's confidence. Victoria wasn't just a queen, she was seen like a mother who took on the responsibility of civilizing all the so-called wild people around the world, the whole white man's burden. They were carrying a heavy burden. It was during this time that Victorian values came about: discipline, strict morality, and outward appearances. But beneath this decorum, the dirtiest game of exploiting the world was going on. Britain found a new way to rule the world. They didn't need to take over every place, they just had to control the markets. If any country refused British traders or broke trade agreements, Britain would send its gunboat-armed ships to that country's coast and force them to comply by threatening to bomb their cities. South America. From the seas to China, the British Navy made sure that nothing blocked the way for British pounds and British goods. The technology from the Industrial Revolution was now used to weave the empire together like a single thread. Britain laid down thousands of miles of underwater telegraph cables. Now, with just a press of a button in London, orders could reach Madras, Sydney, or Canada instantly. Information was power. Thousands of miles of railway lines were built in India and Africa. People thought this was progress. But in reality, it was all about moving raw materials quickly to the ports and suppressing rebellions. The army was ready to be deployed quickly if needed. Britain became the biggest supporter of free trade. It told the world to open up markets for everyone. But this free trade really only favored Britain. Britain flooded other countries' markets with cheap goods made by its machines, which ruined local industries like the weavers in India. London became the economic capital of the world. Investment, insurance, and banking from around the globe started getting controlled from the City of London. Today's global financial system owes a lot to that era. Britain also created a philosophical justification to legitimize its empire. Rudyard Kipling called it the white man's burden. He told the world that they hadn't come to loot but to bring light to a world shrouded in darkness, spread Christianity, and teach law. They made the English language the measure of civilization. They set up an education system to create people who might look Indian or African but thought like the English. Back then, London was the biggest and richest city in the world. The streets flowed with wealth from all over. Just like we saw at the Crystal Palace, Britain showed its power. The Kohinoor diamond during this period adorned Queen Victoria's crown, standing as the biggest proof of India's plundered glory. But right there in London's slums, poverty, prostitution, and disease were at their worst. The empire's wealth didn't spare even its own poor. Britannica Park looked calm and strong from the outside, but inside hatred was boiling just as much. Right next door in Ireland, millions starved to death because Britain kept exporting their grain for its own profit. This was the real face of Britain's so-called peace, East. The India Company's plundering had become unbearable. Britain had grown so big that managing it was turning into a burden. Other countries like Germany and America were gearing up to challenge Britain industrially. Britain's arrogance blinded it to the fact that the world was changing. This golden curtain of Pax Britannica was about to be torn apart on Indian soil in 1857. A fire was about to break out that would shake the company's rule and make Britain realize that the golden bird was now fluttering its wings to break free from its chains. The year 10,857 felt like the East India Company had India completely under their thumb. Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse was used to snatch princely states one by one. Jhansi, Awadh, Satara, they were all boiling with anger. But the real explosion happened where the British trusted the most: their own army. The British introduced new Enfield rifles in their forces. A rumor spread, which later turned out to be true, that the cartridges for these rifles were greased with cow and pig fat. These cartridges. Before using music, they had to bite the cartridges with their teeth. For Hindu soldiers, cows were sacred, and for Muslim soldiers, pigs were forbidden. The soldiers felt that after taking their trade and land, the British now wanted to corrupt their religion too. On March 29, 1857, a soldier named Mangal Pandey from Barrackpore picked up his rifle against this insult and fired at a British officer. Mangal Pandey was hanged, but his sacrifice ignited a fire in the military camps across North India. On May 10, 1857, the soldiers in Meerut openly rebelled. They shot their officers. They broke out of jail and headed towards Delhi. On the morning of May 11, the rebel soldiers reached the Red Fort. They declared the old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as the Emperor of India. Taking control of Delhi meant a real challenge to British rule. Overnight, what started as a military revolt turned into a full-fledged revolution. The fire of revolution spread to Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and Bihar. Great heroes emerged everywhere. The Queen of Jhansi, who fought the British carrying her adopted son on her back. Even Sir Hugh Rose, who had defeated her, said she was the only true man among the rebels. So it was that woman. In Kanpur, Peshwa Nana Sahib took charge. Tadia Tope used his guerrilla tactics to keep the British on their toes for weeks. In Awad's Lucknow, Begum Hazrat Mahal laid siege to the British residency for months. Here, ordinary people joined the soldiers and showed incredible bravery. The British started fearing defeat, and the more scared they got, the more brutal they became. When the British recaptured Delhi and Kanpur, what they did was a dark stain on human history. They publicly hanged thousands of innocent people. The rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons and blown up to scare others. Entire villages were burned to ashes. Bodies hung from the streets of Chandni Chowk in Delhi. Despite such strong spirit, we lost. Why? The Sikhs and Gurkha soldiers sided with the British. Kings like Scindia of Gwalior and the Nizam of Hyderabad helped the British. Canning himself said that if these kings hadn't supported us, we would have had to pack up and leave the very next day. The British had the telegraph, which let them send information quickly. They also had modern weapons. While our brave ones fought with swords and old guns, Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured. His sons were shot dead right before his eyes by an officer named Hudson. The emperor was sent to Rangoon, where he breathed his last. Zafar had written about how unlucky he wasn't even given 2 yards of land for his burial. With this, the Mughal name was wiped out forever. The biggest achievement of 1857 was that it ended the East India Company. The British government realized that a trading company couldn't manage such a vast country anymore. The Government of India Act 1858 put India directly under the British Crown, into the hands of Queen Victoria herself. The British promised that they wouldn't take over any more princely states or interfere in religious matters, but in reality they made divide and rule their main strategy. Although 1857 failed, it shattered the illusion that the British were invincible in the minds of Indians. It sparked a fire of inspiration for revolutionaries like Savarkar and future generations, a flame that continued burning until 1947. After 1857, the British Empire became even more alert and cunning. Their focus wasn't just on India anymore. They were expanding their power eastward, where another great empire, China, was about to fall victim to their sly moves. In the early 19th century, China under the Qing dynasty was a closed and self-sufficient empire. China had everything Britain wanted: silk, porcelain, and most importantly, tea. But China didn't want anything from Britain. The Emperor of China had even written a letter to King George saying, "We have everything in abundance. We don't need your weird stuff." The demand for tea in Britain had grown so much that the British government's treasury was running dry. China only sold tea in exchange for silver. The result was that all of Britain's silver was going to China. The East India Company was looking for a product that Chinese people would be forced to buy. So they started growing huge amounts of opium in farms in Bengal and Malwa, India. This opium was then smuggled illegally into China. The opium trade was so successful that by the 1830s, millions of Chinese workers were. The drug problem had spread all the way to the highest officials. China's economy started collapsing because silver was flowing back to Britain. Instead of working, people were just hanging out at opium dens. The Chinese emperor sent an honest officer named Lin Zexu to Canton. Lin raided the British warehouses and dumped over 20,000 chests of opium into the sea. He wrote an emotional letter to Queen Victoria saying, "If you don't allow opium in your country, then why are you sending it to ours?" Britain saw the destruction of the opium as an attack and insult to their property. They sent their modern navy to China. China had medieval ships, while Britain had iron steam-powered ships like the Nemesis. British cannons turned China's coastal cities into ruins. China lost and had to sign a humiliating treaty. They had to pay reparations, open 5 ports, and most importantly, hand over Hong Kong to Britain. Hong Kong was just a small rocky island, but Britain made it their biggest military and trading base in the Far East. It became the new hub for the opium trade. The center was established and remained part of the British Empire for the next 150 years, but Britain wasn't satisfied yet. They wanted to make opium legal. Using a small incident called the Arrow Incident as an excuse, Britain and France teamed up and attacked again. The British army marched all the way to Beijing, after looting the emperor's old summer palace. They set it on fire and burned it to the ground. That palace was a treasure trove of the world's finest artworks. Lord Elgin burned it to teach China a lesson. China was then forced to legalize opium and allow Christians to spread their faith throughout the country. They had to back down. These wars broke China's backbone. China, which was once the Middle Kingdom and the center of the world, became a puppet for Western countries. Seeing Britain, Russia, Japan, Germany, and America also jumped in to take their share of China. This is known as China's bombing. Because of the wars and opium, a civil war broke out in China, killing around 20 million people. Britain indirectly pushed an entire society toward destruction. Selling opium was strictly banned in Britain, but they were fighting wars just to sell it in China. The profits from opium were so huge that this was how the British Army's entire expense in India was covered, and the royal elite in London lived in luxury. The golden age of the British Empire, the Pax Britannica, was soaked in the blood of China's addicts. The Opium Wars stirred up such hatred in China towards the West that it shaped the Chinese Revolution of the 20th century and the foreign policy of modern China today. Even now, China sees those wars as its greatest national shame. After breaking China to its knees, the British Empire turned its attention to another continent, the one they called the Dark Continent. People used to go there, they didn't want opium or tea there. What they wanted were mountains of gold and diamond mines. Until the 1880s, the interior of Africa was a mystery to Europe. It was called the Dark Continent. But as soon as huge reserves of gold, diamonds, rubber, and copper were found there, the European powers got restless. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium all wanted to stake their claim before the others. Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together 14 European countries in Berlin. The funny thing is, the very Africa that was being bombarded. Not a single African leader was present at that meeting. They drew straight lines across the map of Africa using just a scale and pencil. They didn't consider which tribe lived where or what languages they spoke. Tribes that had lived together for centuries were split into different countries, and tribes that fought each other were forcibly shoved into the same country. The roots of the civil wars still happening in Africa today can be traced back to that Berlin Conference. The face of this plunder on Britain's side was Cecil Rhodes. He was so greedy that he said, "If I could have taken over the stars if I wanted to." Rhodes took control of the diamond mines and created the De Beers Company, which still rules the diamond world today. Rhodes dreamed of having Britain's rule stretch all the way from Cape Town in the south of Africa to Cairo in the north, connected by one straight railway line. To make this happen, he ordered the massacre of thousands of African warriors. The area we now call Zimbabwe was once named Rhodesia after him. African warriors like the Zulu and Sudanese were brave, no doubt, but they stood no chance against Britain's advanced technology. It wasn't just any gun. The Maximum gun, the world's first automatic machine gun. The British Army faced thousands of Sudanese warriors in Sudan. British poet Hilaire Belloc wrote, "Whatever happens, we've got the Maximum gun and they don't." The slaughter was brutal. In just a few hours, 11,000 Sudanese warriors were slaughtered by machine gun bullets, while only 48 British soldiers died. This wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Africa was important to Britain not just for its diamonds, but also for the Suez Canal. Built in 1869, this canal cut thousands of miles off the route from Britain to India. Britain trapped Egypt in a debt trap and then took over the entire country in 1882 to seize control of the canal. The Suez Canal became the lifeline of the British Empire. What Britain and other powers did to extract rubber from the African jungles was horrifying. African people were forced into labor, and if a village didn't meet its quota, as punishment, children's and women's hands were cut off. Africa is blessed with abundant resources and was the richest continent, yet its people were the poorest. They got made, all their gold started decorating the banks of London. Rhodes and Britain used religion to hide their loot. Their slogan was Christianity, commerce and civilization, Christianity, business and progress. There's an African saying, when the missionaries came they had the Bible and we had the land. They told us to close our eyes and pray. When we opened them we had the Bible and they had our land. Britain took the divide and rule tactic in Africa to a whole new level. Lord Lugard came up with the indirect rule method. He used local. The British gave money and power to the local leaders so they could keep their own people under control like slaves. This way the British didn't have to face direct opposition and their plundering continued. By 1900, except for Ethiopia and Liberia, the whole of Africa was under European control. The wounds Britain inflicted on Africa are still alive today in the form of poverty, dictatorship, and civil wars. Africa did gain independence, but its soul and resources were stolen forever. After conquering Africa, Britain thought there was no one who could challenge it, but in the soil of South Africa, the British faced a serious challenge from people of their own kind, the Boers, which exposed the British Army's weaknesses and gave the world the terrifying term concentration camp. In the next chapter, we'll explore a bloody war where white men fought white men, the Boer War, and the massacre that gave rise to leaders like Churchill. By the late 19th century, South Africa was split in two. The British controlled the coastal areas, but the Boers lived in the interior regions of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were Dutch-descended people who loved their freedom and their land. The British didn't care about them. It wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been the world's biggest gold and diamond mines there. In 1886, a gold deposit was found in Johannesburg. Cecil Rhodes and the British government wanted that gold under their control. Thousands of British and foreign people flooded into the Boer lands searching for gold. The Boers didn't give them the right to vote. Using human rights as an excuse, Britain started putting pressure on the Boers. In 1889, Rhodes tried to overthrow the government through the Jameson Raid, but it failed miserably. This made the Boers cautious and they began stockpiling modern German rifles. They got started. War broke out in 1899. Britain thought it would be over in a few weeks, but the Boers shook them up. The Boers didn't wear uniforms, they were expert marksmen and horsemen. They would strike suddenly and then vanish. In just 1 week of December 1899, the British Army lost 3 major battles. The world was stunned that a handful of farmers were beating the biggest empire on the planet. When British General Lord Kitchener realized he couldn't defeat the Boers on the battlefield, he resorted to the scorched earth policy. British soldiers burnt down Boer. They burned down most of the houses and farms. They poisoned the wells and slaughtered their cattle and livestock so the Boers' fighters wouldn't have any food or supplies. Thousands of women and children were left homeless. Then the big question was, what do we do with them? This is where the darkest chapter of the British Empire began. Britain set up camps for these homeless Boer women and kids. They called them refugee camps, but in reality they were death traps. Food was barely given, there was no sanitation, and diseases like measles, typhoid, and whooping cough spread rapidly. Around 27,000 Boer women were in these camps. Kids were killed, most of them were under 16. When this news reached the British Parliament, Britain got globally slammed. At the same time, separate camps were set up for black South Africans where thousands of Africans died in anonymity. 2 of history's biggest names were involved in this war. Churchill was there as a young journalist. He escaped from a prison held by the Boers and became a hero overnight. This war was his stepping stone into politics. Gandhi was a lawyer in South Africa back then, helping the British. They set up an ambulance corps. They thought that by showing loyalty, Indians would earn respect. But after the war, the British attitude changed Gandhi's mindset and pushed him towards the path of satyagraha. In 1902, the Boers surrendered. Britain won, but it was an empty victory. The war cost Britain so much money that its economy wobbled. After winning, Britain made a deal with the Boers, the white Boers, but they left the black South Africans to fend for themselves. That's the thing. That agreement later gave rise to the terrifying system of racial segregation and apartheid. The Boer War showed the whole world that the British Army was tired and outdated. When Britain recruited soldiers, they found out that 40% of young men were too malnourished to even fight. This was a wake-up call for Britain. Germany and Russia realized that if Britain was properly challenged, it could be defeated. The golden era of Pax Britannica was coming to an end. The Boer War made Britain even more ruthless and defensive. They realized that now they needed allies. Out of this fear, they started forming new alliances in Europe, which pushed the world towards the First World War. The Cold War hadn't even cooled down yet when Britain's focus shifted to the borders of Central Asia, where Russian influence was looming. This was a region no one could ever conquer: Afghanistan. History calls it the Great Game, a tale of espionage and battles between Britain and Russia. Afghanistan was a nightmare, the final resting place for some of the British Empire's finest soldiers in the 19th century. Britain was only afraid of one country, Russia, the Russian Empire. Russia was rapidly expanding from the north. Britain feared that Russia would attack the most valuable part of the Indian Empire through Afghanistan. This fear and the resulting spy game came to be known as the Great Game. The heart of this game was Afghanistan, a place easy to get into but almost impossible to get out of alive. Britain believed Afghanistan was a buffer zone for India. If Russia's influence grew in Kabul, Kolkata would be in danger, Lord Auckland decided. They planned to remove Afghanistan's ruler, Dost Mohammed, and put their own guy, Shah Shuja, on the throne. The British seriously underestimated the Afghans' pride and their tough geography. In 1839, the British Army of the Indus marched proudly into Kabul. They did install Shah Shuja as king, but the Afghan people saw them as foreign invaders. Afghan fighters launched guerrilla attacks from the mountains. The British supply lines were cut off, and by the harsh winter of 1842, the 16,500-strong British force was forced to abandon Kabul. Amid heavy snowfall, hungry and exhausted soldiers were attacked by Afghan tribal warriors in the Khyber Pass. Out of thousands, only one man, Dr. Braden, made it alive to Jalalabad. He reported that the entire British army had been wiped out by the Afghans. This was the most humiliating military defeat in British history. The Great Game wasn't just fought on the battlefield but also in dark alleys and mountains. Britain sent pandits and Indian spies to Afghanistan and Tibet to map the region. These people carried their prayer beads, rosaries. Grain seeds were used to measure distances. This was the same spy who named this game the Great Game. He and his companion Colonel Stoddart were thrown into a filthy prison cell and killed by the rich man of Bukhara. In this game, life was cheap. To take revenge for the defeat, Britain returned to Afghanistan. This time they did capture Kabul but faced the same hatred and rebellion again. Here, Afghan heroine Malalai rallied the fleeing Afghan army by turning her scarf into a flag, leading them to a strong victory against the British forces. Britain realized they couldn't enslave Afghanistan. They said, "You handle your internal affairs. Just leave foreign policy to us so that Russia can't come here." In 1893, Sir Mortimer Durand drew a border between Afghanistan and British India. This line split the Pashtun tribes into two parts. Even today, this line is the biggest reason for disputes and terrorism between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Britain, for its own security, broke the heart of an entire tribe in two. The Great Game extended from Afghanistan all the way to Tibet. Britain was afraid that the Dalai Lama might make a deal with Russia. Colonel Francis Younghusband led his army into Tibet. At a place called Guru Guru, thousands of unarmed Tibetan monks were massacred with Maxim machine guns. Britain forcibly opened Tibet for its trade. But in 1907, this all suddenly came to an end. Why? Because a new and dangerous enemy was rising in Europe: Germany. Russia and Britain, who were bitter enemies just before, now became friends to stop Germany together. Afghanistan was recognized as an independent buffer zone. Britain then. Billions of pounds were spent, and thousands of lives lost in Afghanistan, but they gained nothing. They planted such deep hatred for the West in the hearts of Afghans that even after 150 years it still lingers in the form of the Taliban and other conflicts. Britain may have won the Great Game, but it never conquered the soul of Afghanistan. The Great Game had worn down the British army, but the real disaster was yet to come. The poison of European politics was starting to bubble up. The empire that until yesterday was teaching the world about peace, the Britannica way, was now heading towards its own ruin. That's where we left off. In the next chapter, we'll look at a war that changed the world: trench warfare, poisonous gas, and the first major crack in the foundations of empires. On June 28, 1914, a single bullet in someone's pocket set the whole world on fire. Britain didn't enter this war by choice but because of its obligations and alliances. But once they stepped into this mess, they had no idea that this war would mark the end of their golden age, the Pax Britannica. Britain thought soldiers would be back home by Christmas, but machine guns and heavy artillery brought the war to a standstill. Thousands of miles of trenches were dug. Soldiers lived for months knee-deep in mud, surrounded by rats and dead bodies. For the first time, poisonous gas, tanks, and airplanes unleashed deadly chaos. The generation from Britain studying at Oxford and Cambridge became dust in those trenches. They were called the Lost Generation. July 1st was the darkest day in British military history. In just a few hours, 20,000 British soldiers were killed and 40,000 wounded. A total of 60,000 casualties just like that. One day, commanders like General Douglas Haig mistook soldiers for nothing more than cannon fodder. They ordered thousands of young men to run towards machine guns, where death was almost certain. Britain never could have won this war without India. About 1.5 million Indian soldiers shed their blood for Britain in the deserts of France, Iraq, and Egypt. More than 74,000 Indian soldiers lost their lives. The India Gate still stands today as a tribute to them. Indians fought with the hope that after the war, Britain would grant them independence or at least dominion status. But what did Britain give in return? The Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the Rowlatt Act. This betrayal only fueled the fire of Indian nationalism. The economic decline of the four empires. Before the war, Britain was the world's biggest moneylender and creditor. After the war, it became the biggest debtor. The rise of U.S. dominance. Britain had to borrow huge loans from America to fight the war. The dollar started replacing the pound. Britain's economic backbone was broken. Shift in power. The world's center began moving away from London towards New York and Wall Street. The Gallipoli massacre was Winston Churchill's greatest defeat, the Gallipoli disaster. Churchill had a plan to attack the Ottoman Empire in Turkey to bring the war to a quick end, but the mission ended in utter destruction. Thousands of soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, and Britain got trapped and killed on the hills of Turkey. This defeat made the Anzac troops from Australia and New Zealand feel that Britain didn't really care about their sons' lives. It sparked a strong desire in them to forge their own national identity. During the war, Britain was confident of its victory. It hatched all kinds of deceitful schemes. They promised the Arabs that they would free them from the Ottoman Empire and create a large Arab nation. At the same time, through the Balfour Declaration, they promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine. Britain and France secretly made the Sykes-Picot Agreement and divided the Middle East among themselves. The bloodshed happening in the Middle East today was scripted by Britain during that time. The war ended in 1918. Britain won, but it was a hollow victory. Britain took control of the colonies of Germany and Turkey. It happened, the British Empire was at its biggest geographical peak in history. On the map, the empire looked huge, but in reality, Britain no longer had the strength to manage it. The soldiers who returned from the war weren't the same anymore. They had seen that even white masters could die from bullets, and they could be just as scared as anyone else. The illusion of white supremacy was washed away in the mud of their wounds. Now, demands for freedom and rights began rising in India, Ireland, and Egypt. World War I had left Britain worn out. They gave him life but took out his soul. Now the British Empire was like a patient dressed in fancy clothes on the outside, but whose bones were rotting from the inside. And the first and biggest blast of this weakness happened right inside Britain's own home in Ireland. In the next chapter, we'll see the fire in Britain's backyard, the fight for Ireland's independence, the rise of the IRA, and the bloody conflict that forced the empire to face its own cruelty in the mirror. The British Empire claimed to spread civilization all over the world, but with its neighbor Ireland, the treatment was no less than that of a butcher. Ireland had been oppressed for centuries. During the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s, when millions of Irish people were starving, the British government was exporting grain from there. This hatred and bitterness gave rise to the Irish War of Independence. In the middle of World War I, when Britain was fighting Germany, the Irish revolutionaries thought this was the perfect opportunity. On Easter Monday, 1916, under the leadership of Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, the rebels took control of key buildings in Dublin. They declared the Irish Republic. Britain crushed it with full military force. The rebels were openly executed, but that turned out to be Britain's biggest mistake. The people who were thought to be crazy by the public became martyrs after their execution, sparking a wave of freedom across all of Ireland. In the 1918 elections, the pro-independence party Sinn Féin won by a landslide. They refused to sit in the British Parliament in London and instead set up their own separate assembly called Dáil Éireann. This is where Michael Collins rose to prominence. Collins was a genius. He understood that Ireland couldn't defeat the British Army in an open battlefield. He gave rise to intelligence and guerrilla warfare. The Irish Republican Army, IRA, suddenly started launching attacks on British spies, police, and their bases. To crush the rebellion, Britain sent in a squad of former soldiers known as the Black and Tans. These guys were infamous for their brutality. They burned innocent people's homes, opened fire in markets, and used torture. Michael Collins' hit squad took out 14 British spies in one morning. In response, the Black and Tans hit back at a football match in Dublin. They barged in and opened fire wildly on the crowd, killing 14 innocent civilians. This incident tore off the mask of justice from the face of the British Empire. By 1921, Britain was exhausted. The whole world was condemning them for oppressing their own neighbors. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith went to London. There they signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Ireland was given the status of a free state, but it didn't get full independence. It had to swear loyalty to the British Crown. And the biggest point was that Northern Ireland, the northern part of Ireland, remained with Britain. The treaty split Ireland into two parts. Some people, including Collins, wanted to accept what they had and move forward, but others, supporters of de Valera, wanted nothing less than full independence. This led to a civil war within Ireland. The revolutionaries who had united to fight the British were now killing each other. In this conflict, Michael Collins was assassinated. Ireland did gain independence, but Britain had drawn a divide-and-rule line that wounded the country's soul, and the poison of that division still lingers today. In the north, Protestants who were loyal to Britain. They were loyal and Catholic, but a seed of hatred was planted between those wanting to unite in Ireland, leading to decades of violent chaos. Ireland's victory sent a message to the whole world. If a small country, through guerrilla warfare and unity, could bring Britain to its knees, why couldn't others? The books and methods of Irish revolutionaries like Dan Breen deeply influenced Indian freedom fighters like Bhagat Singh and Surya Sen. Britain had already lost on its own turf. The illusion of its invincibility was completely shattered. Ireland's struggle was a mirror held up to the British Empire. It showed that you can win land with guns but not people's hearts. The wound Ireland inflicted on the British crown never healed. Ireland's fire had blackened the walls of the British Empire, but the real storm was yet to come from the east. In India, a man had risen who shook the foundations of the world's largest empire without lifting a weapon. In the next chapter, we'll see the power of a half-naked fakir. The era of Gandhi and Indian nationalism that showed the world empires could be toppled through non-violence. The year 1919, right after World War I. Chapter 19 was over. The Indians had believed that their sacrifices would earn them freedom. But Britain responded with the Rowlatt Act: no trial, no lawyers, just jail. When people protested, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. General Dyer's bullets killed thousands of innocent people. From that blood-soaked soil came the resolve that eventually wrote the final chapter of the British Empire's rule. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, returning from South Africa, gave India the mantra of satyagraha, truth and nonviolence. He said nonviolence isn't a weapon for the weak but for the bravest. Gandhi said if we cooperate. If they stopped cooperating, the British rule would collapse within a year. For the first time, Indian politics moved out of palaces and offices and reached the villages and fields. Farmers, laborers, women and students all became part of this nonviolent struggle. Gandhi Ji called on the entire country to boycott the British government. Lawyers quit courts, students left colleges, and foreign clothes were burned in bonfires. The spinning wheel became a symbol of self-reliance and resistance. Britain didn't know how to deal with people who weren't fighting or running away, but were just smiling while taking beatings and going to jail. Law and order in Britain started to become a joke. In 1930, Gandhi chose something that belonged to every person's salt. The 24-day journey from Sabarmati to Dandi caught the world's attention. When Gandhi picked up a handful of salt by the sea, it wasn't just salt. It was a challenge to the British salt laws. American and European newspapers headlined, "A frail old man shook the British Empire with his walking stick." The whole world saw through Britain's act of being civilized. People spat on it when helpless protesters were beaten with iron rods. Gandhi's biggest blow hit Britain right in its pocket. His promotion of Swadeshi dropped the demand for British clothes in India. Mills in Manchester and Lancashire started shutting down. Britain was in India just for profit. When Gandhi struck at that profit, London's traders and politicians got worried. Managing India was becoming expensive now. In 1931, Gandhi went to London. There he climbed the steps of St. James's Palace wearing just a dhoti. Winston Churchill called him a half-naked fakir, but Gandhi proved that he was now a winner. They were speaking from their position. Although this conference wasn't successful, it showed the world that the British Crown was now forced to treat Indians as equals. When Britain realized they couldn't suppress nationalism, they introduced the communal award to create divisions among Indians. The poison tried to separate Dalits, Muslims, and Hindus into different electoral areas. Gandhi protested against this with a hunger strike. Britain did create cracks, but the wave of unity was still strong. During the middle of World War II, when Britain was scared of Japan, Gandhi made his final call: quit India. There was no room left for any dominion status or reforms. Indians raised the slogan, Britain, quit India, do or die. Railway lines were torn up, telegraph wires were cut, and in many places people set up their own parallel governments. Britain realized it couldn't keep India enslaved much longer with just guns. The non-violent movement cut the moral ground out from under the British Empire's rule. They had always claimed to be civilized, but Gandhi showed them otherwise. The whole world saw how cruel and unjust they were. Non-violence had worn down the British Empire, but the final blow was yet to come. On one side was Gandhi's non-violence and on the other was Hitler's madness. World War II broke Britain so badly that even after winning they didn't have enough money to run their own country. The empire was out of the question. In the next chapter we'll look at the British Empire's last stand, the Second World War, Churchill's stubbornness, and the destruction that ended the empire on which the sun never set forever. In 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. When attacked, Britain was forced to jump into the war. Winston Churchill, who had once been the greatest defender of the empire, was now leading the bloodiest conflict in the world to save it. But this war wasn't like the ones before, it was total war. By 1940, Hitler had brought France to its knees. The British army got stuck on the beaches of Europe. Soldiers were rescued using boats big and small, but Britain had to leave behind all its heavy weapons and tanks. Germany rained thousands of tons of bombs down on London. For months, the people of London stayed underground. People slept in tube stations. Britain's pride was breaking down, and for the first time it felt its very existence was at risk. Churchill had sworn never to give up, but they had run out of money and weapons to keep fighting. America supplied weapons to Britain, but not for free. In return, the US took over Britain's strategic military bases around the world. By the end of the war, Britain owed so much debt to America that it took until 2006 to pay it off. Japan attacked the British Empire in Southeast Asia. On February 15, 1942, Singapore, once thought invincible, They surrendered. Historians consider this the biggest military defeat of the British Empire. Around 80,000 British and Indian soldiers laid down their arms in front of Japan. People in Asia saw that even the white rulers could be beaten and run away. This defeat sparked a powerful demand for freedom in India and Burma. After the fall of Singapore, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose joined forces with Indian prisoners of war to form the Indian National Army. While Gandhi's nonviolence was wearing down the British, Netaji's army was rallying Indian soldiers in the British Army with the slogan, "On to Delhi." The spirit of rebellion was ignited. Britain no longer trusted its own army. During the war, Churchill's policies caused a terrible famine in Bengal. Bengal's grain was stockpiled for the war effort. When help was requested, Churchill cruelly said, "If there's such a shortage of grain, why has Gandhi died yet?" Around 3 million Indians suffered and died from starvation. This was a modern genocide carried out by the British Empire, proving that Indian lives meant nothing to the empire. In 1945, Germany and Japan were defeated. Britain was among the victors. It was on the list, but this victory was a Pyrrhic victory, a win where the winner ends up ruined just like the loser. British cities were reduced to rubble, rationing was in place, people even had to queue up for bread. The world was no longer multipolar. There were only two superpowers now, the USA and the Soviet Union. Britain had become just a small player. Right after the war, Churchill lost the election and Clement Attlee became prime minister. Attlee faced the reality. Britain no longer had enough military strength to suppress a rebellion in a large country like India, nor did it have. The treasure was enough to keep the empire running, but now it wasn't about saving the empire anymore, it was about how to let it go. World War II drove the final nail into the coffin of imperialism. Britain defeated Hitler, sure, but in the flames of that war its own sun set forever. A wave of decolonization swept across the world. Britain had become an old lion with its teeth all gone. It knew its time to say goodbye had come, but the bloodiest and most painful part of that farewell was still ahead. That golden. The birds repeated attacks, which it had been pecking at for 200 years. By 1947, Britain was worn out from the blows of the Second World War. In India, the flames of rebellion, the INA and the naval mutiny, were so intense that the British realized staying there would be suicide. But the way they chose to leave, the August Partition, was the worst outcome of their 200-year-old divide and rule policy. Lord Louis Mountbatten was sent as the last viceroy. He was supposed to hand over power by June 10, 1948, but he suddenly changed the date to August 15. They displaced 10,947 people. Mountbatten wanted to get away from this responsibility as soon as possible. He didn't care how millions of people would be uprooted in such a short time. The police, army, and administration were all bombarded overnight. The British officials were so busy packing up their things that they ended up throwing India into the fire of a civil war. They gave the job of drawing the border to a lawyer who had never even been to India, Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe was given only 5 weeks. He worked with old maps and incomplete census data. They just drew the lines sitting at a table, with no idea where those lines actually ran. There were many homes where the courtyard was in India, but the kitchen was in Pakistan. The biggest betrayal was that this line was announced 2 days after independence on August 17. People had no clue until August 15 which country their home belonged to. As soon as the line was revealed, the biggest and bloodiest migration in history began. Around 15 million people were displaced. Stations were filled with bodies. The trains crossing the border were drenched in blood. Those trains came to be known as ghost trains. People started leaving because only dead bodies kept arriving. Between 1 to 2 million people were killed. Thousands of women were abducted. Humanity was completely dead, and the British were sitting safely in their camps waiting for their ships to take them back. The slaughter wasn't just about land, it was the death of brotherhood. From the Bengal Partition in 1905 up till 1947, the British continuously fueled hatred between Hindus and Muslims so they wouldn't unite against them. Behind Jinnah's stubbornness and Congress's helplessness was the real mastermind, British diplomacy. When the British were leaving, they gave 565 princely states the option to stay independent if they wanted to, which just caused more chaos. This was their last attempt to break India into smaller pieces. On the night between August 14 and 15, Nehru gave his famous speech. The tricolor was hoisted in Delhi as a twist with destiny. But at the same time, the streets of Punjab and Bengal were stained with blood. While Delhi was celebrating, Gandhi was trying to put out the fire of riots in Noakhali, Bengal. He knew this wasn't the freedom they had fought for. The last British soldier from the Somerset Light Infantry left in 1948. The infantry left from the gateway of India. After 300 years, the shadow finally lifted, but it left behind a bloodied subcontinent. The British complicated the Kashmir issue so much that even after 80 years, it remains South Asia's biggest problem. They strategically handed over Gilgit-Baltistan and the border areas in a way that India and Pakistan have been at each other's throats ever since. Britain's trade and influence could only last as long as the subcontinent stayed stable. After independence, Britain took everything from India but completely emptied its treasures. According to economist Akasa Patnaik, Britain looted about $45 trillion from India during its rule. They left India as one of the poorest countries in the world in 1947, even though in 1757 it was one of the largest economies globally. The partition of 1947 stands as the biggest symbol of the British Empire's failure. They divided a country that had been united for thousands of years. The ongoing tension between India and Pakistan today is the saddest proof of Britain's divide and rule policy. After India gained independence, the British Empire. And so the domino effect of decline began. One after another, African and Asian countries started gaining independence. But the empire, even in its final breaths, wanted to show its strength one last time, and that opportunity came with the Suez Canal crisis. In the 1950s, the British Empire was shrinking, but the Suez Canal was still under their control. This canal was like the empire's lifeline because all their oil and trade went through here. Meanwhile, a new leader was rising in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was a nationalist leader who wanted to free the Arab world from Western domination. On July 26, 1956, he made an announcement that caused a huge stir in London and Paris. He nationalized the Suez Canal. Nasser needed money to build the Aswan Dam, but the US refused to fund it. He said, "This canal is on our land, it was built with the blood of our people, so why shouldn't the profits be ours?" British Prime Minister Anthony Eden couldn't tolerate this. To him, Nasser was like Egypt's Mussolini. Eden was determined to teach Nasser a lesson. Britain, France and Israel cooked up a really sneaky and dirty plan. Israel was going to attack Egypt. Britain and France would jump in as peacekeepers and use the Suez Canal security as an excuse to send in their troops. They told the world they were just there to stop the war, but their real goal was to overthrow Nasser and take back control of the canal. At the end of October 1956, the attack went ahead as planned. British and French paratroopers took over the port and more. Militarily, Britain was winning. But politically, it was shooting itself in the foot. Anyway, they went all out with the axe. The world called it an old-school robbery. The Soviet Union threatened that if the attack didn't stop, they might launch a nuclear strike on London. Britain was counting on their old buddy America to back them up, but President Eisenhower was furious. He was scared that Britain's stunt would push Arab countries into the Soviet camp. Instead of guns, America went for the dollars, financial blackmail. They threatened to cut off economic aid to Britain and even pressured the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Britain's debt got frozen. The British pound started to fall. Britain no longer had the power to fight a war without America's approval. For the first time, Britain had to pull its troops back like a defeated servant. The crisis itself revealed two harsh truths to the whole world. First, Britain was no longer a superpower. Now the world would only move according to America and the Soviet Union. Second, the era of gunboat diplomacy was over. You couldn't just attack a country because you didn't like its leader. At Suez, Britain's defeat lit a fire under the independence movements across African countries. In the 1960s, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, one after another, started gaining freedom. Britain realized it was time to close shop on the empire. They replaced the empire with the Commonwealth to keep their cultural and economic influence alive, but their political rule was over. Prime Minister Anthony Eden had to resign. The British people were split into two groups, those still hooked on the empire and those who were ashamed of this embarrassing episode. They were heartbroken. This incident shattered Britain's confidence forever. After the Suez Crisis, Britain became just another ordinary country in Europe. They started pulling their troops out from all over the world. Their posts in the Far East and the Middle East began to empty. The Suez Crisis proved that the British Empire had become nothing but a thing of the past. But before saying goodbye, they still held on to one last big piece, the final symbol of their wealth and pride. A city they had taken from China and were determined to keep in their grip, Hong Kong. Britain basically snatched the city from China like a thief during the Opium War in Chapter 15. For 150 years, this city was the shining face of British capitalism and power. But that 99-year lease was coming to an end. China was no longer the weak country of the 19th century. It had become a rising giant that wanted its territory back. In the 1980s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher talked to China's leader Deng Xiaoping. Thatcher was hoping to keep Hong Kong under British control, but Deng made it clear, if we don't take it back, then we will. They saw themselves as guilty in the eyes of the Chinese people. The deal called One Country, Two Systems was promised. That meant Hong Kong would be part of China, but its freedom and market would be preserved for 50 years. Chris Patten was sent as the last governor. He tried right up to the end to strengthen democracy in Hong Kong, which really annoyed China. Unlike places like Dublin or Delhi, there was no violence here, just a deep silence and rain. Prince Charles and Prime Minister Tony Blair stood there in the rain. A British band played their old tunes, at night. At exactly 11:59, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. Right at midnight, China's red flag went up. Prince Charles and Chris Patten boarded the Royal Yacht Britannia and disappeared into the waves. Prince Charles wrote in his diary that this was the end of the empire. When Hong Kong slipped away, the British Empire was officially over. But did its legacy end too? Even today, English is spoken in more than 50 countries, and their laws are based on the British common law system. Around the world today, half of the disputed maps are because of wrongly drawn lines by the British, like the Radcliffe or Durand lines. Britain gave the world railways and modern education, but that came at the cost of millions of lives, famines, and massive plundering of wealth. Even today, London's museums are full of looted artifacts from all over the world. The Kohinoor diamond, once a symbol of India's pride, now adorns the British crown. This reminds us that even though the empire is gone, the loot still remains there. From the ruins of the empire, Britain created the Commonwealth, a group of those countries. Countries that were once part of the British Empire. It was Britain's way of staying connected to those places it used to rule over without actually ruling them anymore. The British Empire wove the world together like a thread, globalization, but that thread was made of chains. They talked about democracy but practiced dictatorship. They brought science yet left millions trapped in the darkness of poverty. Today, the very country Britain once called a land of shopkeepers is handing over leadership to people from its old colonies like Sissanak. Sultan, this journey of 10,600. It all started in a narrow alley and ended on a stormy night in 10,997. We saw how people who came in the name of trade ended up becoming rulers, and how one island managed to paint the whole world in its colors. Today, in 2026, the British Empire exists only in history books, but from the streets of India to the forests of Africa, its echoes can still be heard. We're free now, but the history we